Okay, hey, graphic design. Let's talk about Gestalt principles. And they're kind of the foundation for a lot of visual design. And basically, the whole thinking here is how does the brain perceive visual information? So, there's a scholar, Andy Rutledge, who's talked and written a lot about Gestalt principles. But he basically says that everything that makes graphic design work can be found in these principles. We're not going to review all of them today, just maybe the most important ones for getting started, but they're principles of perception, and he says that there's no more powerful tool at a designer's disposal than comprehensive grasp of these principles. So we'll dive into the first few of them. But Gestalt is a German word. It means unified whole. So the idea is that when you look at something, you don't see the individual parts, you see the whole thing. And we'll talk more about what exactly that means. But these principles or theories, they refer to the way in which the human brain makes sense of information. And it's important to know that our brains are wired to find order. So when we're presented with something to look at, we will search for predictable patterns, both to our betterment and detriment. It's actually like it's a good and bad. So these patterns we're going to talk about today are essentially what the eye sees, and it's all based in psychology, so that's kind of cool too. So the first principle is the figure-ground relationship. Figure-ground, it basically refers to what is background and what is read as the element of focus. So a common image here that you're going to see is the one in the upper right hand, where what's the figure, what's the ground? It depends on how you look at it. This one's meant to be unstable and it's meant to be confusing, but do you see two black faces on a white ground, or do you see one white vase on a black ground? So that unstable switching between the two is a good example of figure ground. And when it comes to graphic design, you want to look at this bottom left image where we have these little buttons, like a little directory you'd find on a website. So the one on the left has a very clear background gray rectangle, and the figure is all those blue letters. So it makes it very easy for that brain to see. The right-hand side has the same information, same shapes, but not having those colors makes a big difference in how our brain has a harder time reading that list and also discerning what it is, because there's no figure ground. There's just black on white. So practical example there. And then this is a really fun example of playing with a figure ground, because at first it looks like it's Melbourne Food and Wine Festival poster, very simple. You first see a fork, right? Like that's the first thing you're going to see is a white fork on a black ground. But then to show that it's not just food, it's also wine, having those wine bottles be the negative space in the fork is another fun way of playing with that. And I noticed when you guys uploaded your images to our, like, the digital images that you like to see and you thought were interesting, a couple of you had some interesting figure ground relationships. One person actually had the Brave poster, which is where like the hair of the girl is a fun background. So this is a thing that's used quite a bit. It's used both to make things readable, but also to kind of surprise the viewer. So these buttons make things visible, but this poster surprises the viewer in kind of a fun way. So figure ground, first principle. The next principle is proximity. One of the biggest ways for our brain to say that things are related is when they're close to each other. So, for instance, bottom left, we have four columns, or a grid rather, of circles. We view them as one group. If you space them out a little bit, like on the right-hand side, we sometimes perceive them as two different groups. The color hasn't changed, the shape hasn't changed, just the proximity has changed. And then, same above, now you're going to switch up both the color and the contrast. So top left, we have black columns and orange columns. We view them as separate, maybe because of proximity, but also maybe because of color. It's like you could say either one, because like one is dark, one is black, one is left. The other one is orange and a little bit lighter and to the right. So proximity is helping, but it's not the only one at play. But if you go to the right-hand side, now our columns have both orange and black, both dark and light. We don't view the black and orange as separate anymore. We don't view the dark and light as separate. We view them separate based on their proximity to each other. We have a left-hand side column and a right-hand side column. So I think these are helpful, simple images trying to show you that proximity is a really big factor in how our brain understands information and how it categorizes it. And now closure, the next principle. So this one is really about drawing conclusions. And we do that all the time. We get whatever information we have, whether it be all the information or not, and we often don't even know if we have all the information, and we make conclusions. Our brain kind of has to do that, or else we'll sit in limbo with literally everything in our lives. So again, it's a pro and a con. Sometimes we draw terrible conclusions from not enough information. So it actually is a big human flaw. But for visual design, we have to know that that's how the brain works, and that's what's at play. So when we have less than the full picture, we employ the principle of closure, and we fill in that missing information. So for instance, I think it's called the World Wildlife Federation, that's their logo, they have a panda. Now, it's only black shapes, but we close up the white gaps and make those look like white shapes as well to see an actual panda. But there's actually no white shapes, there's just black shapes. And then in the top right hand corner, those two, so I even think of them as two orange squares. They're really not though. We're implying that the one in the top left, is a full square that's being overlapped by one on the front. Technically, it could be an L shape and a square shape. But the way our brain works is we imply the closure of that background square and assume that it's two squares on top of the other slightly moved, where the one is coming down a little more. And we also imply that the one in front is lower. So, last thing about closure is it's not only just about filling in misinformation that's static, it can also be about movement. So that image down there, we don't perceive those figures as being still in space. We imply that artist has implied that there's both movement towards us and then one of them is about to fall down. So closure is also about inferring information based on what's there, closing up the logic of initial, not just closing up like white space. It's often about closing up white space like in the panda, but not exclusively. And then common region. So when elements share a common closed region, we're going to understand them as being grouped together. So right now we have two sections we were using proximity to say we have a left-hand group of shapes and a right-hand group of shapes, right? But within the group of shapes, there's not a whole lot of information to make out of it. However, if we close up a region around some of those shapes, we suddenly decide that they are the letter T and the letter L. And that's how our brain is going to work with that. So a background region can do a lot to convey to the brain that this is what's important and this is what's grouped together and this is what you should focus on. Just that little difference tells your brain a whole lot. And then in practical terms, this poster for Inside Out is doing the same thing, where you're seeing that if you've seen the movie, you know that Inside Out is all about the different emotions inside one character. And here you have the emotions, all those little people. The poster's telling you because they're grouped inside that person's head, they are all grouped together. They have a relationship, that they are a group that's a unified whole within her brain, or within her mind. So, common region and closure, proximity, and figure ground. Those are the ones we're going to start with. And what I'd like you to do is go to your black square challenge and look over everyone's submissions and start thinking about which principles are being used in which communications. Like, how does someone use a figure ground to communicate something? How does someone use proximity to communicate a concept? What about closure? And then lastly, common region. So think about which ones are actually being applied and start trying to look for them too, and also that shared image references that we have too, because there's a lot there that are using these principles. And that's it. That's the introduction to Gestalt principles.